Nadia sat at her small, second-hand kitchen table, her fingers clenched tightly around her phone. The glow from the screen cast a pale light over her face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones, the tension in her jaw. She had forgotten about the coffee in front of her, long gone cold, its steam dissipated into the chilly apartment air. Outside, the sounds of the city filtered through the single-pane window, the honking of taxis, the distant hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from pedestrians passing below. But Nadia heard none of it. Her focus was locked on the words in front of her. Billionaire Paul Rivas announces engagement to socialite Celeste Navarro. Her vision tunneled, heart hammering, but not because she cared about Paul. Not anymore. That chapter had ended years ago, and she had done everything in her power to forget him, to push him out of her mind like a bad dream that faded with time. But the photograph beneath the headline sent a shockwave through her system, stealing the breath from her lungs. Paul stood beside Celeste, tall and imposing as ever, his expression unreadable. Celeste, beautiful and poised, clung to his arm, the picture of elegance. Yet Nadia barely noticed either of them. Her eyes were fixed on the little boy standing in front of them, his small hand held in Paul's. Dark curls. Big, solemn brown eyes. A face that should have belonged to a stranger, yet Nadia knew it instantly, recognized it in a way that went beyond logic, beyond memory. A single name in bold beneath the image confirmed what her heart already understood. Elias Rivas. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on her, the air suddenly too thin, the space too small. Nadia swallowed hard, but the lump in her throat didn't budge. This wasn't possible. Her son, was here, standing beside his father like he had always belonged there. The phone trembled in her grip. She could barely process what she was seeing, what it meant. She had spent years trying to accept the unbearable, telling herself that her baby was somewhere out there, living a different life, a better one. That her pain had served a purpose. That even if it had broken her, at least he was safe. But this was something she had never even considered. She tightened her grip on the phone, her pulse roaring in her ears. The name, the face, the truth, it all crashed over her like a tidal wave, drowning her in memories she had tried so hard to bury. The sterile white walls of the hospital. The steady beep of machines. The dull ache that radiated through her body as she lay there, exhausted and hollow, staring at the ceiling while nurses moved around her. And then, Irene's voice. Calm. Cold. Final. You're young, Nadia. You don't have the resources to raise him. This is what's best, for everyone. Nadia had barely been able to lift her head. She had been too weak, too devastated to process what was happening. All she knew was that when she reached for her son, he was no longer there. They had told her it was an adoption. That he would be placed with a family who could give him everything she couldn't. That it was the only way. They had lied. Her stomach twisted violently, and she forced herself to keep breathing, to think past the grief that clawed at her insides. They had stolen him from her. A bitter laugh, sharp and humorless, escaped her lips. She had spent years mourning a loss that was never real. She had told herself, again and again, that she had done what was best for him. That it hadn't been a choice, but a necessity. And now, she saw the truth. The Rivas family hadn't given Elias away. They had kept him. Not out of love. Not because they had wanted him. But because he was Paul's son. Because he carried the Rivas name. Nadia pressed a shaking hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through her, and she gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling apart completely. She had nothing. No claim to him. No proof, no legal standing, no power. Paul was one of the wealthiest men in the country, and Irene was even more ruthless than her son. They would destroy her before they ever let her near Elias. And yet, her eyes flicked back to the photograph, locking onto the little boy's face. He wasn't smiling. Paul's grip on his hand was firm, but Elias wasn't holding on. His fingers curled slightly, but not in the way a child clung to a parent for comfort. Nadia knew that posture. She had seen it in the children she used to work with, the ones who were left waiting too long at daycare, the ones who learned young not to expect warmth from the people who were supposed to love them. Her chest tightened. Elias was being raised in wealth, but not in love. She squeezed her eyes shut, the realization cutting her deeper than she thought possible. All this time, she had imagined that at least he was happy. That even if she had been forced to let him go, he had been given something beautiful in return. But what if that had been a lie, too? What if she had left him in a prison made of gold? Her breathing hitched. Her fingers dug into her palm. If he wasn't safe? If he wasn't loved? Then she had to do something. She didn't know what, not yet. She had no plan, no resources, no way to fight back. But she had to get close to him. She had to see him, to know the truth for herself. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a new kind of urgency coursing through her veins. Nadia sat frozen at her kitchen table, fingers curled so tightly around her phone that her knuckles turned white. The air in her tiny apartment felt too thick, her breaths coming too fast. The article still glowed on the screen, but she had memorized every word. Every picture. Every detail that had ripped her life apart in a single instant. Elias was not lost. He was not living a different life, safe and happy in some unknown place. He had been kept. Raised under the roof of the people who had stolen him from her. And now, she was staring at a photo of him standing beside his father, the son of a billionaire, the heir to a fortune, living a life she had been denied even a glimpse of. Her hands trembled as she placed the phone down on the table, afraid she might drop it. The betrayal burned through her like fire in her veins, and her mind raced with one singular, overwhelming thought: she had to see him. She had to get close to him. The logical part of her whispered that it was impossible. That even if she showed up at the Rivas estate demanding to see her son, she would be thrown out before she ever got past the iron gates. She had no legal claim. No money for a lawyer. No power to fight the family that had taken everything from her. But there was another way. Her gaze flicked to the photo again, to the grand estate in the background. It was a fortress, but even the most heavily guarded fortresses had doors. She just had to find one that would let her inside. A live-in nanny. Someone who would be with Elias every day. Someone who would care for him, protect him, give him the love he was being deprived of in that cold, calculating household. She grabbed her laptop, fingers moving before she could think twice. A quick search led her to a high-end hiring website, the kind used by the ultra-wealthy to discreetly find staff. And then, there it was. Private nanny wanted, full-time, live-in position. Experience required. Background check mandatory. Her stomach twisted. The Rivas family was looking for a nanny. It was too perfect, too coincidental, as if the universe had cracked open just enough to give her a sliver of a chance. But could she pull it off? She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with such force that it nearly toppled. She caught her reflection in the dusty mirror by the door. Her hair was too long, too dark, too much like the girl Paul had once known. Her features were sharp with grief, eyes hollowed by years of loss. If she walked into that house looking like this, they would know. She yanked open a drawer, searching for the scissors she kept buried under takeout menus and unpaid bills. Her pulse pounded as she grabbed a thick lock of hair and, without hesitation, cut. The strands tumbled to the floor in uneven chunks, but she didn't stop. She kept cutting, shaping, stripping away the version of herself that was too recognizable. By the time she was done, her hair was shoulder-length, choppy, unpolished. It was still too familiar. She grabbed a box of blonde dye from under the sink, something she had bought on impulse months ago and never used, and dumped it onto her head. The harsh chemical scent filled the tiny bathroom, stinging her nose, but she ignored it. When she rinsed it out, her reflection was different. Not unrecognizable, but enough. She could work with this. She needed a new name. Something simple. Something that wouldn't make anyone look twice. She scrolled through a random name generator until one stuck. Leah Dalton. Leah was ordinary. Leah was forgettable. And for what she was about to do, that was exactly what she needed. She spent the next several hours rewriting her resume, crafting the identity of a woman who had spent years working as a private nanny for wealthy families. She forged references, tweaking them just enough that they could never be traced. Every detail was carefully constructed, every lie designed to slip through unnoticed. Then, with a deep breath, she hit send. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was Elias' face. The way his little hand had rested in Paul's. The way his eyes looked too knowing, too solemn for a child his age. She was taking an enormous risk. But she had to try. The response came faster than she expected. Less than 48 hours later, she received an email. "Thank you for your application. We would like to schedule an in-person interview." Her heart slammed against her ribs. The Rivas estate was just as intimidating as she remembered. Towering gates, pristine gardens, a driveway that seemed to stretch on for Elias. She forced her hands to stay steady as she approached the front entrance, where a man in a dark suit waited to escort her inside. The interview was brief. A woman named Mrs. Sorrell, the household manager, asked her about her experience, her childcare philosophy, her ability to adapt to high-pressure environments. Nadia answered every question with the confidence of someone who had been doing this for years. And then, just like that, she was hired. She could hardly believe it. She moved into the estate that weekend. The guest quarters were luxurious, a far cry from her tiny apartment, but Nadia barely noticed. Her mind was consumed by one thing. Elias. The first time she saw him in person, she almost lost control. He sat on the floor of the grand library, playing with a set of toy cars. His small fingers moved them along the edge of the rug, his focus intense. He was beautiful. Perfect. Her chest ached, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep her hands at her sides when all she wanted was to scoop him into her arms. He looked up at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Are you my new nanny?" She swallowed hard. "Yes," she said, voice soft. "I'm Leah." His lips pressed together, and he gave a small nod. "Okay." Then he went back to his cars. Nadia let out a shaky breath. He didn't recognize her. Of course, he didn't. He had never seen her before. But she had seen him, countless times, in her dreams, in her memories, in the empty space in her life that had belonged to him. She spent the rest of the day watching him carefully. Observing. Taking in every detail, every expression, every small mannerism. She saw the way he hesitated before asking for something, the way he played alone even when other children visited the house, the way he looked toward the door every time footsteps echoed down the hall, as if waiting for someone who never came. He was lonely. Her heart clenched. She had been right. He was being raised in wealth, but not in warmth. That night, after he had been tucked into bed, Nadia stepped out into the hallway, and nearly collided with Paul. The shock hit her like ice water down her spine. He looked the same. Taller than she remembered, maybe, but still as commanding as ever. His dark eyes flicked over her, assessing, but there was no flicker of recognition. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and unreadable. Nadia stepped aside, her breath locked in her chest. He barely acknowledged her as he continued down the hall. He didn't know. She was standing right in front of him, and he didn't know. Neither did Irene, who passed her later that evening with nothing more than a cursory glance. The plan had worked. She was inside. And now, she just had to figure out what to do next. Nadia had been in the Rivas estate for only a week when she began to see the cracks in its perfect, gleaming surface. At a glance, everything was impeccable: the towering ceilings, the sprawling gardens, the kind of old money elegance that whispered rather than shouted. But beneath the surface, there was something hollow, something cold. It was in the way the house echoed with silence, despite being full of staff. It was in the way Elias sat at the long dining table every evening, his small hands resting on either side of a pristine white plate, waiting for a conversation that never came. It was in the way Paul barely looked up from his laptop during dinner, barely acknowledged his son's presence. And it was in the way Irene observed everything, detached, disapproving, as if her grandson were a portfolio to be managed rather than a child to be loved. Nadia had known it wouldn't be easy. She had prepared herself for the challenge of living under the same roof as the people who had stolen her son. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to look at Elias and see a loneliness so deep it made her ache. She watched as he played alone in the garden, rolling a toy truck back and forth over the gravel path. A child with an entire world at his feet and no one to share it with. She had thought the pain of losing him had reached its peak the day she signed the papers. She had been wrong. Celeste was the worst of them all. She barely acknowledged Elias, treating him like an inconvenience, a minor obstacle in her carefully curated life. She floated through the house in designer dresses, her manicured fingers tapping away on her phone, her voice full of honeyed warmth when speaking to Paul, but sharp and dismissive when Elias was near. "I don't know why he won't talk more," she said one evening, her wine glass balanced between her fingers. "He's so quiet. It's strange for a child his age." "He's fine," Paul said without looking up. "He barely even interacts with me," she added, feigning disappointment. "I hope he won't be difficult once we're married." Nadia bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted blood. Elias wasn't difficult. He was careful. He was reserved, hesitant, always watching, waiting. Nadia had spent hours studying him, learning his expressions, the way his eyes flickered with unspoken thoughts. He wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because no one listened. One afternoon, she found him in the library, flipping through a book that was far too advanced for his age. "What are you reading?" she asked, sitting beside him. He turned the cover toward her. "A collection of myths." "Do you like it?" He nodded. "What's your favorite story?" He hesitated, then pointed to one. She skimmed the title. "The Minotaur." He nodded again. Nadia flipped through the pages. "That's an interesting choice. Why do you like it?" Elias studied the book for a moment before answering. "He's trapped in a maze." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes," she said softly. "He is." That night, Nadia sat on the edge of his bed, tucking the blankets around him. The room was too big for a child, too impersonal. It was beautifully decorated, but there were no drawings pinned to the walls, no stuffed animals cluttering the shelves, no evidence that the space belonged to a little boy at all. She smoothed his hair back gently. "Would you like a story?" He nodded, and she reached for a book from his nightstand. Halfway through, she noticed his eyes growing heavier, his lashes fluttering against his cheeks. She kept reading, her voice softer now, lulling him into sleep. Then, just as his breathing slowed, his tiny fingers curled into the sleeve of her sweater. His voice was barely a whisper, slurred with exhaustion. "Mommy?" Nadia's whole body froze. She sat perfectly still, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. His hand remained tangled in her sleeve, his grip loose but familiar. As if it belonged there. As if this were natural. As if the universe had not been torn apart the day they had been separated. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I'm here," she whispered. Elias exhaled, content, and drifted back into sleep. Nadia sat there for a long time, staring at him, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile magic had settled over the room. She had never let herself think about what it would feel like to hold him, to comfort him, to be the one he reached for in the night. The weight of it crushed her, beautiful and unbearable all at once. She had told herself she could do this. That she could stay close to him without crossing a line. That she could be the nanny and nothing more. She had been wrong. Her hand trembled as she brushed his curls from his forehead. She wasn't just here to watch over him. She wasn't just here to be near him. She was here to take him back. The Rivas estate was always cold, but that evening, it felt unbearable. Nadia stood in the dimly lit hallway just outside the formal dining room, hands gripping the fabric of her dress, trying to steady her breathing. From where she stood, she could hear the laughter, the clinking of expensive glassware, the murmur of conversation between Paul's elite guests. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She had been heading toward the kitchen to check on Elias when she overheard Celeste's voice, sharp, amused, cutting. "He'll be gone by the end of summer," she said, her tone light, as if she were discussing redecorating a guest room. Nadia stilled. "Boarding school is the best thing for everyone," Celeste continued. "It's time he learns how to behave properly. I've already looked into a few options. There's one in Switzerland that specializes in boys from complicated family situations." Nadia's pulse pounded so hard she could barely hear the rest of the conversation. She edged closer, careful not to be seen. Paul's voice came next, indifferent as always. "Is that necessary? He's young." "Exactly," Celeste said, her voice dripping with the kind of patience people used when explaining something obvious to a child. "The younger, the better. He needs structure, and frankly, he needs to be out of the way. It's what's best for him." Nadia's stomach twisted. "You know how difficult he is," Celeste continued. "He barely speaks. He doesn't respond to affection. Not that he gets much of it in this house." A laugh, one that made Nadia's skin crawl. "God knows I've tried, but I'm not his mother. He doesn't take to me, and that's fine. A school like this will help." Paul didn't respond immediately. Nadia could imagine him sitting at the head of the table, distracted, scrolling through his phone as Celeste plotted his son's future. When he finally spoke, it wasn't anger or concern that colored his voice. Just detachment. "If you think it's best, handle it." And just like that, it was decided. Nadia clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She felt dizzy, unsteady, as if the ground had been yanked out from under her. They were sending him away. This wasn't just about Celeste's cruelty. This wasn't just about her selfishness, her inability to see Elias as anything other than a problem to be solved. Nadia had always known she was heartless, but this was calculated. Elias had no idea what was coming. He was upstairs in his bedroom, probably curled up with his book, waiting for her to come tuck him in. He didn't know that in just a few months, he'd be taken from everything familiar and sent across the world, alone. Nadia had spent weeks forcing herself to be patient. Telling herself that being near him was enough. That as long as she could give him small moments of love, that was enough. It wasn't enough anymore. She had to stop this. A sharp, familiar voice cut through the air. "It's the right decision. Irene." Nadia barely had time to duck behind a marble column as Paul's mother stepped into view. She moved through the dining room like a queen surveying her kingdom, her pearl earrings glinting under the chandelier light. Celeste turned to her, smiling as if seeking approval. You agree, don't you? Of course, Irene said smoothly, taking a seat. It will simplify things. Nadia's nails dug into her palms. That was all Elias was to them, an inconvenience. A burden. Something to be managed and pushed aside. She needed air. She needed to get away before she said something reckless, before she stormed in there and shattered the illusion she had carefully built. She turned quickly, heading down the hallway, but as she passed Paul's office, she slowed. Voices. She recognized Irene's, but the other belonged to a man she didn't know. It was low, measured, confident in a way that sent a chill through her. She knew she should keep walking, that she had already put herself at risk tonight, but something in their hushed tones made her pause. She lingered by the door, listening. The transfers need to be finalized soon, the man was saying. The accounts have been structured carefully, but if anything happens, there needs to be a buffer. There won't be a problem, Irene replied. There's always a risk, the man countered. The assets need to be untouchable, beyond scrutiny. Irene exhaled, as if growing impatient. And you're sure placing them in the boy's name will keep them safe? Nadia's breath caught. Elias. She forced herself to stay still. The man continued. It's the cleanest way. If anything were to go wrong, he's a child. No one would question it. The assets would remain protected under the trust. You and Paul wouldn't be implicated in any way. Nadia felt a slow, sinking dread spread through her stomach. She didn't understand the specifics, but she understood enough. They weren't just keeping Elias out of convenience. They were using him. She pressed herself closer to the wall, her mind racing. She had known something was wrong. She had sensed it in the way Irene watched Elias, in the way Paul had no real interest in him, in the way everything about this house felt like a carefully managed illusion. They had been shifting money in his name. It wasn't love that had kept him in the Rivas household. It wasn't duty. It was something much colder, much more calculated. Nadia clenched her jaw, her fists tightening. They thought they could do whatever they wanted. That no one would stop them. They were wrong. Nadia sat on the edge of her bed, her breath unsteady, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly it left an imprint in her palm. The room was dim, a single lamp casting a soft glow over the neatly arranged furniture. It was a beautiful space, far nicer than anywhere she had lived in years, but it might as well have been a prison. The Rivas estate was nothing more than a gilded cage, one that had trapped Elias since birth. Her mind reeled, looping the conversation she had overheard in Paul's office. Irene's voice had been calm, confident, as she spoke with the financial consultant about transferring more assets into Elias' name. The implication had been clear: if something goes wrong, the money will be in the boy's name. No one will question it. No one will be able to trace it back to us. She had listened in stunned silence as the consultant explained how the money was layered across international accounts, all linked under Elias' legal trust. His name was being used to protect their fortune. If the government ever came sniffing, if anything illegal was discovered, the Rivas empire would remain untouched. Elias would take the fall. Nadia pressed a shaking hand to her mouth, bile rising in her throat. They weren't just neglecting him. They weren't just sending him away because he was inconvenient. They had never seen him as a child at all. He was a shield. A vault. A pawn. The weight of it crushed her, made her stomach churn, made her fingers tremble against the phone. She had come into this house thinking she could survive on borrowed time. That being close to Elias, even in secret, was better than not seeing him at all. That loving him quietly was enough. But she couldn't love him quietly anymore. She had to get him out. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through her contacts, searching for the only person who could help her now. She hesitated when she saw his name, thumb hovering over the screen. It had been years. A lifetime ago. He would probably hang up. But she had no other choice. She tapped the call button, pressing the phone to her ear, pacing the length of the room as the dial tone rang. It rang once. Twice. A groggy voice answered. Do you know what time it is? Nadia closed her eyes. The sound of his voice hit her harder than she expected, the familiarity of it almost enough to break her. Asher, I need your help. Silence. Then a sigh. It's bad, isn't it? Her throat tightened. Yeah. There was a rustling on the other end, the sound of him shifting, sitting up. A yawn. A pause. Tell me. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady her voice. They never gave him up, Asher. They kept him. Another pause. Longer this time. They what? She sat back down on the bed, gripping the edge, her fingers curling into the fabric of the sheets. They told me he was going to be adopted. That it was the only way. That I had no choice. Her breath hitched, but she pushed through it. It was all a lie. Jesus, Nadia. His voice was sharper now, the sleep gone from it. She kept going, forcing herself to say it all. She told him about Elias, about how he barely spoke, how he was being raised in a house where he was ignored, neglected, and now being shipped away like an inconvenience. And then, finally, she told him about the money. She repeated everything she had overheard. The offshore accounts. The way every single suspicious financial move was tied back to Elias' name. The money laundering. The paper trail that didn't exist because in the eyes of the law, a child could not be investigated. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. Asher let out a low curse. They've been using him as a shield, he said, his voice grim. He's their insurance policy. Nadia pressed her palm to her forehead. She had been unraveling it piece by piece, but hearing it said out loud, he's their insurance policy, made her stomach twist even harder. I need proof, Asher. I need everything they've done, every account, every transfer. If I can take this to court, I might have a shot at getting him away from them. There was another silence, a different kind this time. Then, finally, Asher exhaled. This isn't just fraud, Nadia. If they've been hiding assets under a child's name, that's illegal, she whispered. Beyond illegal. His voice was razor-sharp now, his brain already working through the layers of corruption. If I do this, it's going to get messy. They have security, firewalls. You're not going up against some hedge fund executive. You're going up against a family that runs entire industries. They don't play fair. I know. You could get caught. I know. They could kill you for this. She closed her eyes. I know. Another long silence. Then, you're really willing to go all the way with this? Nadia let out a slow, shuddering breath. She thought about Elias. She thought about the way he hesitated before speaking, the way he looked down when people asked him questions, the way he had whispered mommy in his sleep. There was no going back. I have to. Asher sighed again, a deep, resigned sound. All right, he muttered. I'll get you what you need. She exhaled, barely realizing she had been holding her breath. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. His voice was serious. I need time. At least a few days. I'll have to break through layers of security. If they're doing this on the level you're describing, there won't be a direct trail. They'll have people covering their tracks. Nadia nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I understand. And Nadia? She stilled. Yeah. When this is over, you run. She gripped the phone tighter. She knew that. She had always known that. If she pulled this off, if she exposed them, if she won, she wouldn't be able to stay. But none of that mattered. Because for the first time since stepping foot in this house, she finally had a plan. Nadia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone as if she could force it to ring through sheer willpower. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the moonlight filtering in through the window. The Rivas estate was eerily silent at this hour, no distant hum of conversation, no footsteps echoing through the hallways, no murmurs of late-night staff shuffling about. Just silence. Her stomach churned. Every second that passed felt like it stretched longer than the last. The weight of what she had asked Asher to do pressed heavily on her chest. She had barely slept since their last conversation, since she had given him the task that could either save Elias or bury them both under a mountain of consequences. She checked the time on her phone. 3:17 a.m. Too late for normal calls. Too early to give up hope. And then, finally, the screen lit up. Asher. She answered before the first ring had finished. Tell me. There was no greeting. No small talk. Just the kind of silence that filled the space right before someone changed your entire life. You were right. Nadia's fingers tightened around the phone. About what? Asher exhaled, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice, something sharp, like a warning wrapped in disbelief. Nadia, it's worse than we thought. Her body tensed. The entire operation, every offshore account, every shell corporation, every single dollar they've hidden, it's all tied to Elias. The words hit like a punch to the gut. She gripped the blanket beneath her, her knuckles turning white. What do you mean? They've structured everything in a way that makes it look like the money belongs to him, Asher explained, his voice low and urgent. Every shady deal, every fraudulent investment, every offshore transfer, it's all buried under trusts and accounts in his name. If anything goes wrong, he's the one who takes the hit. Nadia's heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had known they were using him. She had known Irene and Paul saw Elias as nothing more than an obligation, a name to keep clean for the public. But this was something else entirely. She could barely get the words out. If I take him away, what happens? Asher hesitated. If you gain custody, they lose access to everything. Her breath caught. They need him, Asher continued, his voice growing darker. Not because they love him. Not because they care. Because he's their golden ticket. A sick feeling settled deep in her gut. Elias was 6 years old. 6. And his entire existence had been reduced to a financial loophole. Nadia pressed a shaking hand to her forehead, her fingers tangling in her hair. They don't care about him, she whispered, more to herself than to Asher. No, Asher's voice was firm, cutting through the haze of her thoughts. They don't. She squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing against the bile rising in her throat. If I win custody, they'll have to let go of the money? They'll have no choice, Asher confirmed. Either they let you take him and keep quiet, or they fight it and risk a full-blown investigation. And Nadia? She forced herself to answer. Yeah. If they lose the money, they lose everything. The room felt too small. The air, too thin. Nadia had spent weeks convincing herself that taking Elias away was impossible. That she would never have the power to win against people like Irene and Paul. But now she had something she had never expected. She had leverage. She had the only thing that mattered to them. A path began to take shape in her mind, one built on risk and consequences, but also on something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since stepping into this house. Hope. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. I need a lawyer, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Someone who can handle this. Someone they won't see coming. I've got someone, Asher said. Colin Wellsworth. He's sharp, ruthless, and doesn't scare easy. She had heard the name before. He was a high-powered attorney with a reputation for dismantling his opponents, not just beating them in court but crushing them. He won't back down. No, Asher assured her. And he works fast. I already set up a meeting. Her breath hitched. When? Tomorrow. Nadia's fingers curled into the sheets. Everything was moving so quickly. For weeks, she had been standing still, trying to figure out how to exist in Elias' world without breaking the fragile illusion of her new life. But now, she was done waiting. She barely had time to thank Asher before he hung up. She set the phone down, pressing both hands to her face. This was happening. A slow, deliberate breath filled her lungs. This was happening. She stood up and crossed the room, her steps careful as she approached the bedside table. Beneath a stack of books sat a small folded envelope, barely noticeable. She picked it up and opened it, revealing a few soft strands of dark brown hair. Elias. She had collected them from his pillow earlier that evening. Just a few strands, barely enough to notice, but enough to be tested. Enough to prove the truth. Tomorrow, she would send it in for a DNA test. Tomorrow, she would start the war. Nadia sat in the back of a nearly empty cafe, the air thick with the scent of coffee and burnt toast. The flickering neon sign outside cast strange shadows across the table, but she barely noticed. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the paper cup in front of her, the cardboard denting slightly under the pressure. Across from her, Asher's fingers moved rapidly over his laptop keyboard, the screen reflecting in his glasses. Next to him, Colin methodically flipped through a stack of legal documents, tapping a pen against the tabletop in an absent rhythm. It had taken weeks to get here. Weeks of quiet observation, of forcing herself to smile through conversations with Irene, through tense dinners where Paul barely spoke, through Celeste's endless, condescending remarks. Weeks of pretending she wasn't suffocating under the weight of it all. And now, finally, they were ready. Colin didn't look up from his papers as he spoke. This is the last chance to change your mind. Nadia exhaled, steadying herself. I'm not changing my mind. Asher smirked slightly. Didn't think so. Colin closed the folder with a soft thud. We go after them on two fronts. Legally, we have everything we need to move forward with the custody case. The DNA test results came back. There's no room for them to dispute it. We're arguing fraud, deception, and financial misconduct. The moment we file, Paul and Irene will have to scramble. Nadia nodded, gripping the cup tighter. And the second part? Asher leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head. The cyber attack goes live the second they're served with papers. Their entire financial network is built on Elias' trust. I'll be locking them out of it. Every account linked to his name? Frozen. They won't be able to touch a single cent without drawing attention. Colin checked his watch. The wedding is in 3 days. That's when we hit them. 3 days. Nadia's stomach twisted. Paul and Celeste's wedding was set to be the event of the season. Hundreds of guests. Journalists stationed outside the estate, desperate for a glimpse of the Rivas heir and his glamorous bride. It was the perfect distraction. The perfect moment to strike. Irene would be too busy entertaining powerful guests. Celeste would be absorbed in making sure every detail of her wedding was perfect. And Paul, well, Paul would be standing at the altar, completely unaware that the walls were about to close in around him. But between now and then, Nadia had to pretend. She had to keep moving through the house like nothing had changed, keep nodding politely when Irene made offhand remarks about Elias' future. She had to act like she wasn't about to take everything from them. She returned to the estate that evening, walking through the marble-floored halls with the same careful, measured steps she had perfected in the past few months. Irene was in the sitting room, a glass of wine in hand, chatting with an older woman Nadia didn't recognize. Celeste was on the phone, listing last-minute wedding preparations. Paul was nowhere to be seen. Nadia made her way upstairs, pausing just outside Elias' bedroom. She pushed the door open quietly, exhaling softly when she saw him already asleep. His small body was curled beneath the heavy blankets, his stuffed rabbit clutched against his chest. She stepped closer, kneeling beside the bed, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. For weeks, she had told herself she could do this, live in his world without shattering it, love him in secret without letting it break her. But she couldn't anymore. She couldn't sit at the edge of his bed knowing that in just a few months, he would be sent away to a place where no one would hold him when he had nightmares. She couldn't stand by while they used him as a financial shield. He stirred slightly, shifting toward the warmth of her touch. And then, so softly she almost missed it. "Mommy?" Nadia froze. Her pulse pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. It was a sleep-drenched whisper, a fleeting moment, but it shattered something inside her. He didn't know. He couldn't know. But somehow, he did. Her throat ached, her vision blurred at the edges. She swallowed, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the blanket over him. "I'm here," she whispered. Elias let out a small breath, settling back into sleep. Nadia stayed there, unmoving, her hand resting gently on his. If there had ever been any doubt left in her, it was gone now. The next morning, Elias was unusually quiet at breakfast. He pushed his scrambled eggs around his plate, his small fingers tapping restlessly against the table. Nadia leaned down beside him. "You okay?" He hesitated, glancing around the room. Irene was speaking with one of the staff members. Celeste was scrolling through her phone. Paul was reading the newspaper. No one was paying attention. Finally, he looked up at Nadia. "I had a dream," he said softly. She set down her coffee. "What kind of dream?" His fingers traced invisible shapes on the table. "That you were my mommy." Her breath caught. The room blurred at the edges. She forced herself to smile. "Was it a happy dream?" Elias nodded. "I think so." Then, after a moment, "I think I'd like it to be real." Her hands tightened around the edge of the table. She had to swallow down the emotion rising in her throat, forcing herself to keep her face neutral. This was it. This was why she was doing this. 3 more days. Just 3 more days, and she would make his dream come true. The Rivas estate had never been so alive. A constant hum of conversation filled the air, the sharp clinking of champagne glasses mixing with the delicate notes of a string quartet playing in the garden. The scent of fresh-cut roses drifted on the breeze, mingling with the warm summer air. Guests, dressed in the finest designer gowns and tailored suits, moved through the manicured grounds, exchanging pleasantries, sipping expensive wine, completely unaware that the world they had come to celebrate was on the verge of collapse. Inside the estate, behind the scenes, the staff moved with practiced precision. Nadia had spent the morning like she had spent every other day in this house, moving through the shadows, quiet and unnoticed. But today, something was different. Her heart pounded, but her face remained neutral. She passed by Irene in the main sitting room, where the woman was sipping coffee and speaking to a well-dressed guest, her tone polite but distant. Celeste was upstairs, adjusting the final details of her wedding gown, giving orders to her stylist in a voice that carried through the hallways. Paul was nowhere in sight. Nadia slipped into the kitchen, gripping the cool marble counter to steady herself. Her fingers curled around her phone in her pocket, her pulse pounding beneath her skin. The message was already typed. One simple word. Ready. Her stomach twisted as she stared at it. This was it. No more waiting. No more pretending. She took a slow breath and hit send. Somewhere across the city, Asher and his team received the message. A series of commands were executed in the span of a second. Every account under the Rivas name, every single one linked to Elias, locked. Every fraudulent transaction, every offshore fund, frozen in an instant. No one in the Rivas family knew it yet. But they would. Nadia tucked her phone away, straightened her posture, and left the kitchen, slipping back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Outside, the wedding ceremony was about to begin. Hundreds of guests filled the white chairs lining the lush garden aisle, their conversations hushed as the officiant took his place. Paul stood at the altar, looking exactly as he always did, impossibly composed, unreadable, a man who had spent his entire life in control. He had no idea. Nadia stood at the back, hidden behind the last row of chairs, her heart slamming against her ribs. She barely heard the soft music playing, barely felt the warm breeze against her skin. She was waiting. And then, movement. A man in a dark suit emerged from the house, walking with brisk, deliberate steps down the aisle. His presence sent a ripple through the ceremony. Guests turned their heads. Celeste frowned. But the man didn't hesitate. He went straight to Paul. There was no whispering. No pulling him aside. He simply handed Paul a folder. The officiant cleared his throat, attempting to smooth over the interruption. Shall we continue? Paul barely heard him. His fingers tightened around the folder as he flipped it open, his brow furrowing as he read the contents. The silence stretched. Irene shifted in her seat, irritated. What is this? No one answered her. Paul's face had changed. His jaw locked. His grip on the papers was tight enough to crumple the edges. He flipped another page. His breath hitched. The silence became deafening. Nadia felt it before it happened. Paul looked up. His gaze cut across the crowd, sharp and searching, until it landed on her. And in that single moment, she saw it. Recognition. Slow at first, like a flicker of something distant, something buried. And then, realization. Shock. Confusion. Rage. And beneath it all, something else. Something dangerously close to guilt. Nadia didn't look away. Irene rose from her seat, snatching the papers from Paul's hands. She scanned the first page, her expression darkening. This is a custody case? Colin had made sure there was no room for argument. Every detail was there. The DNA results. The fraud. The financial misconduct. The complete, airtight legal argument that made one thing clear: Elias had never belonged to them. A sharp inhale. A rustle of movement. The guests were whispering now, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their polite cellias fading. Celeste took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists. This is ridiculous. This is. She turned to Paul, waiting for him to shut it down. To fix it. But he wasn't moving. His eyes were still on Nadia. And for the first time, in all these months, he truly saw her. The weight of it pressed against her chest, but she didn't falter. She had spent too long being unseen. Irene's face was pale now, her carefully crafted mask beginning to crack. How dare you, she hissed, her voice low and shaking. Nadia lifted her chin. How dare I? Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It cut through the air, sharp and unyielding. How dare you? The word sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Guests exchanged glances, confusion and curiosity sparking between them. Celeste let out a sharp, forced laugh, trying to salvage the moment. This is some kind of joke. Nadia tilted her head. No, her voice was steady, unshakable. It's not. The legal machine was already in motion. The papers had been filed. The accounts were frozen. There was nothing they could do. Irene clenched the papers in her hands, her breath uneven. Paul still hadn't moved. The officiant cleared his throat. Shall we? Paul finally spoke. No. The word came out quietly, but it carried through the entire garden. The crowd stilled. Celeste turned, blinking. What? Paul's gaze never left Nadia. No, he repeated, the weight of it settling into his chest. He looked down at the papers in his hand again, as if seeing them for the first time. The DNA results. The reality of what they had done. The past crashing into the present. And then, slowly, Paul closed the folder. The wedding was over. And the Rivas Empire had begun to fall. The courtroom was heavy with tension, the kind that pressed into the air and made even the most powerful people feel small. Nadia sat at the plaintiff's table, hands resting on her lap, her expression carefully composed. Across from her, Paul sat rigid in his chair, his jaw locked tight, while Irene was stone-faced, her nails tapping against the polished table in an uncharacteristic display of nerves. The Rivas legal team sat between them, their expressions unreadable, but Nadia could tell, they weren't as confident as they had been at the start of this hearing. Colin flipped through the custody documents one last time, his demeanor sharp, professional. He had been methodical, walking the judge through every detail of Nadia's claim, how she had been lied to, how she had been manipulated, how she had never willingly given up her son. The DNA results had been entered into evidence, making it undeniable, Elias was hers. The Rivas lawyers had tried their best to paint Nadia as a nobody, someone with no financial stability, no ties to high society, no way to provide Elias with the kind of life he had grown accustomed to. But Colin had cut through their argument like a blade, shifting the focus back to what mattered, the emotional neglect, the lack of parental involvement, the way Elias had been treated more like a distant obligation than a child in need of love. The case was strong. But Nadia knew strong wasn't always enough. The Rivas name carried weight, influence that stretched far beyond the walls of this courtroom. If Paul and Irene wanted to fight, they could. If they wanted to drag this out for years, drown her in legal fees, exhaust her until she had nothing left to give, they could. Unless they were given a reason not to. Colin straightened in his seat. Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to request a brief recess before we continue. The judge, an older man who had been watching the proceedings with careful neutrality, nodded. Granted. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Nadia's stomach nodded as she followed Colin out of the courtroom, her pulse pounding. Paul and Irene's lawyers stood to do the same, their murmured conversation hushed as they stepped into the hall. Colin led Nadia down a separate corridor, away from the crowd of onlookers who had gathered to witness the high-profile case. A few minutes later, they entered a private meeting room, where Paul, Irene, and their attorneys were already waiting. The air was different in here, tighter, heavier. Paul sat stiffly, arms crossed, his gaze locked on Colin. Irene, however, didn't sit. She stood near the window, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Colin took his time setting his briefcase down, flipping the latches with slow, measured precision. Then he glanced at Nadia, giving her a brief look of reassurance before turning his attention back to the Rivas lawyers. We've been focusing on custody, Colin said, his tone smooth, almost casual. But we all know this could go another way. One of the Rivas lawyers, an older man with a graying beard, narrowed his eyes. We've already made our position clear. Paul Rivas is the best choice for Elias' future. He has the resources, the stability. Colin cut him off. And the financial misconduct. Silence. Irene's posture stiffened ever so slightly. Paul's fingers twitched against the table. Colin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. We could fight this case in court. We could let the judge decide. But I have a feeling you don't want that. The graying lawyer scoffed. You have no case beyond the custody claim. Colin smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. You sure about that? Nadia sat still, saying nothing, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside, she was barely breathing. Colin pulled out a thin folder and slid it across the table. Paul didn't move. Neither did Irene. The lawyer sitting beside them hesitated before finally picking it up, flipping it open. His jaw clenched. Irene finally turned from the window. What is this? Documentation, Colin said. A little preview of what could come next. The lawyer's hands tightened around the folder. This is privileged information. Colin didn't blink. Not anymore. The lawyer turned to Paul, whispering something Nadia couldn't make out. Paul's expression didn't change, but she saw the shift, the tightening of his shoulders, the way his jaw ticked. He wasn't stupid. He knew what was happening. Colin sat back. If you contest custody, this becomes a full-blown trial. Discovery is a dangerous thing, isn't it? Because if we have to go digging, if we have to start unpacking every financial move tied to Elias' name, well. He shrugged. That wouldn't look great for you, would it? Irene's nails pressed against the fabric of her skirt. Paul exhaled slowly, but he still hadn't said a word. Nadia clenched her fingers together beneath the table, willing her heart to slow down. Colin's voice softened, but his meaning was razor-sharp. You can let this case go quietly. Agree to the custody arrangement, walk away with your name intact. Or, you can fight, and we'll take this to court, and you'll risk everything. Silence. Long stifling. Then, finally, Paul spoke. How do we know you won't go public anyway? Colin tapped his fingers against the table. You don't. Paul turned to Nadia. It was the first time he had truly looked at her since they had stepped into the room. She didn't look away. His gaze flickered, something unreadable shifting beneath the surface. A lifetime ago, he had been the person she had loved most in the world. Now, he was just the man standing between her and the only thing that mattered. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, then looked at his mother. Irene's expression was tight, but she nodded. We withdraw our claim to custody, Paul said. Nadia barely breathed. Colin smiled, standing. Smart choice. 15 minutes later, they were back in the courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses. Before we continue, does the defense have any additional arguments? Paul's lawyer cleared his throat, his voice tight. No, Your Honor. My client has decided to withdraw his request for custody. A whisper ran through the crowd. Nadia's chest rose and fell in measured breaths, her pulse steady. The judge nodded, flipping through the paperwork. The court awards full legal custody to Nadia Dalton. The gavel struck the wood. Nadia turned to Paul, her voice calm, steady, but cutting straight through the air. You stole my son from me. I'm just taking him back. Paul didn't respond. Didn't move. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The courthouse doors swung open, and Nadia stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, her heart hammering in her chest. The world outside felt too bright, too loud, too fast. She gripped Elias' small hand in hers, her fingers curling protectively around his, as if she were afraid he might slip away. The crowd outside was a blur of journalists, photographers, and onlookers, their voices a chaotic hum of curiosity and speculation. Nadia didn't stop. She didn't look back. Colin was at her side, his posture straight, his expression unreadable as he guided them toward the waiting car. The driver was already holding the door open, and Nadia barely hesitated before ushering Elias inside. As soon as the door shut behind them, Nadia exhaled, her shoulders sagging under the weight of everything she had carried for so long. She had won. The words felt surreal, too big to grasp all at once. For years, she had lived with the crushing certainty that Elias was lost to her forever. And now, he wasn't. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the courthouse behind, leaving everything behind. Elias sat beside her, his small fingers still laced through hers, his eyes wide as he stared out the window. Nadia studied him, searching for any trace of fear or confusion, but all she saw was quiet curiosity. "Where are we going?" he asked softly. "Somewhere safe," she wanted to say. "Somewhere where no one will ever hurt you again." Instead, she smoothed his hair back and gave him a small smile. "Somewhere new." He nodded, as if that answer was good enough. Colin cleared his throat from the front seat. "Your flights are booked. Your documents are ready." He handed her a thin folder. Nadia took it with steady hands, flipping it open. New names. New passports. New lives. Elias Rivas no longer existed. Neither did Nadia Dalton. She traced her fingers over the new names printed on the documents, something tight and unspoken welling in her chest. She looked up at Colin, searching for words, but all that came out was, "Thank you." He nodded, his expression softening. "You did this. Not me." The car wove through the city streets, taking them closer to freedom with every passing mile. By the time they reached the airport, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting everything in golden light. Nadia held Elias' hand tightly as they moved through the terminal, her pulse steady, her mind focused. The paperwork passed inspection without a hitch. The new passports were scanned, the tickets issued. One step at a time. One breath at a time. And then, they were on the plane, and Nadia exhaled fully for the first time in years. Elias leaned against her, his body warm and small, his breath even. She pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, letting her eyes drift shut as the plane carried them away from everything that had once felt impossible to escape. They were free. The air was warm when they landed. Different. It smelled of salt and earth and something unfamiliar but welcoming. Nadia adjusted the strap of her bag, looking around as they stepped out into the new world that was now theirs. The small house she had arranged was simple, nothing like the cold opulence of the Rivas estate, but it felt right. A place where laughter wouldn't echo into empty halls. A place that belonged to them. That night, Nadia tucked Elias into his bed, smoothing the blankets over him, her heart swelling and aching all at once. She wasn't sure if he fully understood what had happened. If he grasped how much had changed, how much had been taken and given back. But then, in the softest voice, he whispered, "Mommy." Nadia froze. She had waited so long to hear it. Her fingers trembled as she brushed his hair from his forehead. "You had a dream?" "No," he murmured, his eyes already fluttering shut. "I just know it's you." Her breath hitched. And then, before she could stop herself, she pulled him into her arms, holding him close, holding him tight. She had won. She had her son back. And this time, no one would ever take him away again. The next evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, mother and son walked barefoot along the quiet shore, the waves kissing their feet, the sky painted in soft pinks and golds. Elias giggled as the water rushed over his toes, his small hand wrapped around hers. Nadia looked down at him, at his bright eyes, at his unburdened smile. They had left everything behind. And in doing so, they had gained everything.